This week, the lecture is meant to introduce you to permaculture design principles and ethics. But first, let's back up for a minute. Overall, permaculture is a design method for designing sustainable, regenerative systems where humans can live and get what they need as far as food goes and community needs, and provide for the wildlife and natural world and the ecosystems that support that. So it's a sustainable form of design. But permaculture is also a movement towards greater sustainability and activism towards more justice and diversity in our natural world for conservation and biodiversity, and also in our social world as well. We'll talk more about all of these things as the semester goes on. I'm just going to give you a big, broad look at permaculture first. So it's a design method, it's a movement and a network of people. It's also a best practice framework. These permaculture methods that are used for designing small farms and producing food and providing for people and the natural world and building soil and ecosystems, these are all goals of permaculture. And each of the methods that's used are gleaned from land-based cultures, mostly indigenous cultures that have used methods for thousands of years to sustainably live in an area. And those can be used today in some of our newer methods. When, for example, switching over from monocultural agriculture, where we grow one crop in hundreds and thousands of acres of just one crop and bring in all the fertilizer and bring in all the pesticides to make sure that crop grows. We can look back to some ancient ways and even non-ancient ways of sustainably growing that crop, making it less polluting, less depleting of the soil nutrients and fertility, and use that as a best practice, so to move forward. So we look back to the land-based cultures to get ideas. We look to the natural world for ideas on how to design our systems more sustainably, and then we look forward and use those towards reaching our goals of more greater ecosystem stability and health and sustainability. And permaculture is a worldview too, and we'll go into that more as we go on. Overall, permaculture is about designing regenerative human settlements. So in permaculture design, we're looking to use nature as our guide for designing human systems and human settlements. So in one way, for example, let's say you're going to use permaculture design to design a garden or small farm. You would look at natural systems and look at the patterns and the connections between different organisms, how they're set up, and try to mimic that through permaculture. And you do it in a way also that sets the system up to regenerate that ecosystem. So current agricultural systems, current economic systems, and resource systems that humans use tend to deplete the environment of the resources. So usually cities, you have less and less soil, less topsoil, less fertility in the soil, you have less clean air, the water is getting more polluted, you have more consumption, and that area is getting less healthy for humans to live in. The goal of permaculture design is to design systems that are so based on ecosystems, on natural ecologies of an area, that the systems tend to regenerate. So over time, the soils in a permaculture designed farm or garden will be richer as time goes by. The soils will get better. The people will have more natural capital at their fingertips, meaning there will be more produce, more trees with more biomass for use for fuels or wood. There will be more animals can survive there. So the system gets richer, or at least it maintains its resource levels. That's regenerative. Most of our current Western culture systems are depleting of their resources. So we want to design systems that are sustainable, and if not just sustainable, but actually enhance those systems as we live in them. So it's a big goal of permaculture, and I'm not saying that permaculture meets this goal perfectly or is any kind of silver bullet, but it is a method which seeks to build these systems and keep keeps trying to be creative in hitting this mark, which is pretty different than the mark that we have out there right now, which is humans are living on the earth. Not all human communities, but most human communities and cultures are just taking whatever they need and having to live with the byproducts or the devastation to the environment from those cultures. We haven't switched really to focus on building systems that regenerate. So that's that. Permaculture is a worldview about cooperation between organisms, not just human to human, but other organisms to humans, and also positive human and environment relationships. And a lot of that information is gleaned from land-based cultures like indigenous cultures, some of which have ways of living with the earth that are very sustainable, and holistic design framework. Permaculture as a movement there's teachers like myself, there's practitioners that actually can be hired out for permaculture design. There's international bioregional networks and conferences and convergences. Permaculture as a practice is a best practice framework, as I mentioned in the first slide. And permaculture design, the focus of this class, is based on ethics, principles, and some design tools and processes too that help the designer get closer to that goal of actually mimicking a natural system. What permaculture is partly trying to do is take humans and put them back into the equation of an ecosystem. We should be an active, facilitative, and even beneficial part of an ecosystem, not an extractive and negative influence on the system. So again, some land-based cultures, indigenous cultures, found ways to survive in certain habitats. Depends where you're looking at. There's examples from all over the world, but they found ways to live with their environments that did not deplete the resources for the future generations. They maintained them. And this is similar to what we're trying to aim at with permaculture design. So it's a pretty different starting point for designing things. And we'll talk a lot about that. Here are some definitions from the first slide. As I said, permaculture is about designing regenerative human settlements. What does that word regenerative mean? It means designing a settlement that helps support the humans in all their needs, social, emotional, spiritual, and cultural too. And it also supports the natural world that is there in that community, the plants, the animals, the soil microbes, all of that. Helps build soil, helps increase biomass of living plants and trees, builds more social capital. People have more of what they need and they have more time. So it's an idea, and it's, not saying that permaculture design is perfect and has the answer to everything, but it shoots towards that. It is aiming towards designing systems that are more regenerative rather than depleting, which a lot of our human settlements and systems right now are not regenerative. They deplete the natural resources. They deplete the humans in their energy and their time and their nutrition. So we're trying to go the other way with permaculture. Permaculture as a worldview, it's based on cooperation, not competition. And permaculture is one of the main tenets of permaculture is it's looking to the natural world, looking to ecosystems for better ways to design and guide our human systems. So if you look at the natural world, there's a ton of cooperation. There is competition, of course, that's what we call it, but there's a lot of interaction between the organisms, giving and taking, sharing, partitioning of resources. And permaculture uses that to emulate the human systems designs to make them more holistic and more ecological. Permaculture is also a network, and permaculture is a practice, as I mentioned in the last slide. And permaculture design is based on ethics and principles that guide that design, and we'll go into detail on those this week. One thing that permaculture does that is somewhat unique is when you're going to design a system, maybe a small farm or garden at a site, you start with as long as possible, observation and experience of a landscape. So you take a long time to really notice that site. Go there in different days, different times of day, different seasons, different weather, during the rain, during the dry period, if you can, and gather as much information about what's already happening there ecologically, energetically. Some of the things that you'd want to notice, the natural dynamics of that landscape, would be things like, what's the topography like? How does that affect the light, the temperature, the water runoff? How does it affect the vegetation? What's the hydrology, the way the water moves through the site, including the atmosphere, plants, animals, soil? What's the climate like and the microclimates? Soil conditions, natural patterning is used as a design basis. So it's something you see, what is naturally already seems to be the way the plants want to grow. And that's one example. And you could use that when designing your system. Nutrient cycles, what's happening there? Do you see a runoff, an erosion where some of the soil fertility is being lost? And where does the water hit on the site and where does it pool up? Where's the dry spots and the wet spots? Look for the energy flows, the way the wind comes through the site. Again, the solar energy, wildlife, how are they moving or using the site? And then political, financial, and cultural systems are also involved. How are those forces limiting or influencing this site? So using all of that is just the first step in permaculture design. You want to observe and understand what's going on. And then when you start building your design, you want to work with the things that are already happening there. For example, some people might say, they get a new house in, say, Goleta, 3-bedroom ranch house, just has lawn and a bunch of shrubs. And they say, we love Hawaii. Let's say these are your clients. We love Hawaii and we really want a kind of a tropical feel of this house. So they take out the lawn and the shrubs and they bring in all kinds of tropical plants and bananas and palms and things. What they're not doing is what we just talked about. They're not looking at what the site can provide, what kind of climate and water regime or precipitation, what can be supported here naturally. It would not be a tropical Hawaiian-like landscape. That's something you're going to have to add a lot of water to, a lot of nutrients. If it gets really cold, a lot of the plants will die. If it gets really hot, some of the plants will die. So you want to work with the site, not against it. You don't want to plant plants that need a lot of kind of well-drained soil in the low spots where the water pools up. But you wouldn't know where those are until you spend a lot of time on the site. So a lot of these things are pretty straightforward. But a lot of designers, like landscape designers and landscape architects, are not thinking about these things. They mostly just ask, what does the client want? It doesn't matter what the ecosystem and the natural world there can support on its own. It's just what the human wants. So we're trying to get kind of back in sync and put humans back into that equation of an ecosystem. So we work and are part of that system, working with it, not against it. That's working against these systems is what causes a lot of pollution and overconsumption, a lot of waste in our human systems now. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the ethics that guide permaculture designers. We will talk more about these as the semester goes on. Earth care, people care, fair share. Those are the three ethics that guide all of the more nuanced and smaller scale types of principles for permaculture design. So these are the three main things that overarch everything a permaculture designer does. Everything that's designed, whether it's a small farm or a community garden, or it's a raised bed, whatever it is, it needs to, in the permaculture designer's mind, it needs to take care of the earth, meaning the non-human earth, all the things, the living things, and all the systems there. It needs to take care of the people. Of course, we're people. We want to build systems that care for and support us. And fair share, that resources are shared. And as a designer, you could start designing something, say, oh yeah, I've got this, client, they want their yard to be turned into, more of a food forest. They want lots of fruit trees and vegetables and raised beds. They want it to be really productive and give them a lot of food. It's kind of a trend right now anyways. So as you start to design that, you would ask yourself as a permaculture designer, okay, I've laid out my first ideas of what we're going to do. We're going to put raised beds right over here by the garage, and we're going to build a small orchard here next to the driveway, and a compost pile, and maybe some chickens. You would stop at certain points in that design and say to yourself, okay, let's ask this question: does my design take into account the natural world around here and provide support for the wild organisms, including the microbial ones and the fungal ones, the things you can't see, while also providing for the humans? It needs to do both. That's something unique in permaculture design, that you would not hear a landscape designer or architect asking that question of their own design. People care. The question is, does my design care for all aspects of humans that will use this site? Their physical needs, food, shelter, temperature, control. They need to be warm sometimes and cool at other times. Does it provide for their emotional needs and their social needs, etc.? This needs to be a site and a design that works for them. If you plan it so that they have to be walking out to the chicken coop, which is at the very edge of the property, and that's 200 yards away, it might take up too much time. It's taxing. It could dip in and cut into their other social time because they're taking so much care of this garden that's not very self-sustaining, and now they have time for nothing else. So it has to do all of these things, or at least that's what we're trying to get more support, a system that takes into both of these things into account. Okay, fair share. I think most people can get their head around earth care. We want to conserve species and blah, blah, blah. And people care. Yes, of course, we all care about each other. In general, that those are ethics that are out there in our Western world in general. Fair share is a little more alternative or radical. So you're building this design for these people, and you stop and ask yourself, does my design allow for surplus resources like harvests of food? If I have extra time or labor or funds or energy or water, does this design allow those things to be shared with other people, with the natural world, with families, with communities that don't have as much? So it quickly gets political, and it's not meant to be political to ask this question. It's meant to be ecological. If you look at an ecological system, an ecosystem, everything is connected to many other things. Every organism, individual one, is connected to many other organisms of different species and even the same species. So there's a lot of interchange, a lot of what we would call sharing. These nutrient cycles are open. Trees can get the nutrients, fungi can get the nutrients, microbes can get the nutrients, animals and plants get them. Animals get them from eating the plants get them from the soil. Excess is not stored up and hoarded by any one organism or population in the natural world. Humans step outside these ecological laws and tend to hoard and lock up certain resources that are not available to anyone else, even other humans, but also other organisms. So we do that with water, and we do that with our air, and there's a lot of things we could talk about how we need to build into our system the redistribution of surplus because it's ecological. A really interesting part of permaculture design, and perhaps making it somewhat edgy, is the fact that it really addresses social inequalities in our systems, in any kind of system, financial system, energy distribution system, class system, meaning classes, socioeconomic classes, agroecological systems, agricultural systems. So really, social inequity is a lack of people care and a lack of fair share, if we tie it back to the ethics. It's a form of ecological imbalance. That's how a permaculture designer would see it, is that our human systems, our cultures, and the way things are set up for who gets what are imbalanced. And we tend to have systems that where resources and privilege and money accumulate into small areas in our cultures and societies, And that is, in the long run, just not a very sustainable or balanced system. It's weak and it's unstable in general. So, and it's true in ecosystems. Usually you don't have one species garnering, or let's just say even a few individuals of one species in an ecosystem sequestering and getting most of the resources and holding on to them so nothing else can get any of those resources. That's a strange kind of human culture artifact that isn't in line with ecological way things work. So that's what this is getting at. And our cultural inequities, our racism and our classism, and there's people that the haves and the have-nots and the privileged and the unprivileged, that also can be seen as a something that is not ecological and inherently not very strong and not very stable. So social inequities and even ecological inequities, they will also come together and result in cultural and ecological erosion. So we have to be in good relationship with each other and with the other living organisms for things to be really solid and strong and to last and to be stable. Otherwise, we have things changing all the time politically and economically and ecologically too. Most of you, if you probably sat down and said, okay, if I had to think about it, is the planet's collective ecosystems doing well, or are they not doing so well, or are they maintaining? If you see it as not doing so well or could be doing better, then this is one of the ways we can improve upon that. Again, permaculture design isn't meant to point a finger. It's not like environmental activism. It's not saying this company is to blame or this political regime is to blame. It's saying, let's look at the Earth. The Earth has natural systems that have been evolving and adapting for hundreds of thousands of years. And there's ways that they work, and there's ways they change and adapt too. Humans are diverging from that pattern, that kind of plan somewhat, if not a lot. They're not following the laws of ecology. We're not, and these are the ways we're not allowing for fair share for everyone to get what they need. And we're not caring for the Earth, the non-humans. In most ecosystems, all the organisms within that system are supported. That's why they're there. They're able to be supported by that system. But now we have humans that are kind of taking more than their fair share and not giving back to support the other organisms. It's not to say humans are bad or wrong. It's to say that it's not going to work in the long run because it's not ecological. It's not based in the way the operating system of this Earth works. There's my message. Of course, people care can also quickly veer into the political spectrum. But again, we keep looking at things through an ecological lens in this class. We're trying to build human support systems, communities, gardens, whatever it is, in a way that more closely mimics natural systems. Natural systems, ecosystems, think of one. And that has been evolving and adapting for millions and millions of years. So what you're seeing right now, like take the oak woodland all around Santa Barbara, the area, just an oak woodland, go walk into a canyon, you see lots of oak trees, you see shrubs, you see birds, there's organisms in the soil. That oak woodland is the latest representation of millions and millions of years of change. So it's pretty stable. It's had a lot of time to vet itself. Organisms have come and gone if they couldn't last there. And what you're seeing is something that's well honed. Human systems are not nearly as long in history. We don't have millions of years of evolution of our cultures, maybe thousands, but that's shorter. And so what we're trying to do is build into our human systems more of an ecological look. So social inequity or inequality is really a lack of people care. and fair share. So two of the ethics are not met when we have humans are treated very differently. When one human gets a lot more resources than the other, and the human that has a lot more resources actively prevents the others from getting it. And that's a very hot topic in our culture right now, of privilege of some and the power that comes with that privilege, and I think the hesitancy of people that have that power and privilege to give it away. And so, again, easy to get political here, and there's lots of feelings around this. But if we just look ecologically at it, okay, think about a redwood forest. Have you ever been to a redwood forest? Okay, so redwood trees grow a long time, some of them a couple thousand years or more. But still, those trees are not really hoarding all their resources. They have a lot of carbon in their wood, but most of the resources are shared. The seeds, the habitat, lots of decay and drop of organic matter to build the soil. That is a tree. The redwood tree actually does hold on to resources for longer than a lot of other organisms, but overall, they're not held on to too long. They're always shared. There's a lot of sharing and interaction of organisms with each other. And our human systems need to be built that way, and permaculture design guides us to do that, to say, like, the more social equity we can have, the stronger the system will be. The more diverse, just like biodiversity, the stronger the system will be. The more possible solutions, the more possible ways for things to live. That's how ecosystems are. They have lots of different niches and resources, and the more organisms that are there, the different types of organisms, the more that will survive some kind of perturbation or stress. Say there's a fire or a flood or an earthquake or a landslide, something that stresses out that ecosystem. When you have a wide variety, a big biodiversity of living things at that site, most of them will survive that. And the ones that can handle those traumas, those ecological disturbances, will survive, and that system will go on. And it's the same with human social groups too. Our human systems need to be very diverse, and each organism or each individual human have access to most of the same resources. And in that sense, that system becomes much stronger and much more stable and sustainable. Now I'll introduce you to the Permaculture Principles. This is a short list. There are many other principles, but they are further refining of the ethics. So you're actually doing a design. The ethics help guide you in a large general sense, but the principles guide you in a more detailed sense. So you want to observe and interact with your environment first, where you're going to do your design. You really want to know it well, what's happening there naturally. Practice conservation with all that you design, the way you set up your design, the way you manage it, handle it. You want to conserve resources as much as possible. Value diversity and edges, and I'll talk more about that later. Reciprocity between elements in your design. That's something that's important. The more interchange of resources between two different organisms or elements in a design, the stronger it is, and the more efficient it is too. Many functions for each element, many elements for each function. So these are ecological functions or social functions, anything that supports the humans and the ecosystem of your site. Catching and storing as much energy as possible, and using the appropriate scale for your site. Again, I just wanted to read the list off, but we will talk more about each of them. I'm going to give you some examples of each of these right now. So my wife and I spent a year living in Guatemala helping Mayans, this one group of Mayans called the Kekchi Mayans that live in the very eastern lowland forest, helping them nutritionally. That was the goal. And so we went down there, and we started a small demonstration farm. So we grew lots of different plants and gave away seeds, and we're trying to get the local people to be interested in growing more than just corn and beans. So they had, when we got there, it had been, it was about 2 years after the end of their 39-year civil war. And it was really awful as far as, what it did to the people. So these Kekchi Mayans were not even from this lowland kind of coastal, tropical, hot type of part of Guatemala. They were from the highlands, and they had just been fleeing the violence. And they, where they were living when we went down there in those lowland areas, they kind of dropped off a lot of their traditional ways of farming. They weren't growing nearly as many different types of foods. They were not growing many things that had much iron or vitamin A. And we were seeing a lot of vitamin A and iron deficiencies in the people, especially the women. So we kind of focused that in our garden. Here's, showing different plants for them to grow that could improve their nutritional status. So we used permaculture methods. That's when I was first learning about it. And this banana circle is something that's known in permaculture all over the world, especially the tropical world. But it's a way where you dig a big hole about 2 meters in diameter and 2 meters depth, and you take all the soil from that and put it around the edge in a berm. That's what you're seeing here. So it's like a little mound all the way around the edge of that hole that you dug, and plant bananas into that berm. The bananas need a lot of water. They need a lot of nutrients. So you throw all your garden refuse into the hole in the middle. It's like a big composting pile there. And as the leaves and green waste decompose, they feed the bananas, and they also keep it moisture on the banana's roots. This whole banana circle berm is mulched. Other plants are grown in there. You can't really tell by the image, but there are sweet potatoes growing in the center. There's medicinal plants also between the bananas. And there's a little notch where that berm doesn't go all the way around, and it's on the uphill side of that banana circle. So when it rains, water flows into the center of that banana circle. So it's conserving in water, and when water moves across the soil, like runoff from a storm, it usually carries sediment too, and that sediment has nutrients and organic matter. So this catches and stores the energy that's inherent in the water and the nutrients and the eroded soil. It conserves resources by helping minimize evaporation and keeping the roots of the bananas cool. It conserves also nutrients by the bananas growing right into the very rich center there, that compost pile. And you have a number of functions. This one element, this is another principle, besides reciprocity, more than one function for this one element. The element would be the banana circle, like a design element, kind of like a thing, a structure in your garden. This one catches and stores nutrients and water, grows bananas, grows medicine, acts as a compost pile. So there's many functions for one element. The reciprocity, hopefully you've already kind of figured that out by now, but the bananas are able to get nutrients from the green waste, and the green waste breaks down and feeds the soil, and the bananas feed the people. There's a lot of reciprocity going on there. Some other examples of the permaculture principles: valuing diversity. So we want to have as diverse of a garden or farm or system as possible to make it more strong, and companion planting is a way to do that. This man here is a man that I worked with. He's a Kekchi Mayan named Manuel Akmo, and he is growing tomatoes here, but he knew just from his own cultural background that they don't just grow one crop, one species. They don't do monoculture, and they always grow tomatoes with a bunch of different species. They grew onions with that, something that's like cilantro called culantro, and garlic and amaranth with the tomatoes. So the tomatoes are producing as much as they normally would, but you've got all these other plants in there, including the Flor de Muerto or marigolds that are planted interspersed with the tomatoes, and they repel some soil pathogens. So that's companion planting, and it makes for a much more diverse garden. It helps a diverse garden, vegetable garden that has lots of different species kind of mixed up, will deter and kind of tamp down the number of pests. The pests don't have as many of one species to attack, and it's harder for them to find the plants that they like, and the plants help each other by putting out chemicals in the soil, like the marigold puts out these natural nematode resistant chemicals into the soil, and nematodes are a plant pest, so that helps all of the plants in that. So that's how diversity is a stronger system. It's more like a natural system. You know, where do you go in the world and you see only one species growing for acres and acres? Only one. I mean, you always see a few. You look at an oak woodland around different places in town, and yeah, you mostly just see oak trees and maybe some grass under it, but if you look closer, there's all kinds of other species. Practicing conservation, all the things you're seeing in the image were gleaned on site. The vines make the string, the branches were from the jungle nearby, the soil had to be composted and made on site. This was a few hours by boat to any town, and there was no Home Depot to go buy compost at, so this was just a more extreme example of conservation, but the more you can conserve, the more stable and sustainable it will be. An example of this principle, multiple functions for each element, just kind of a fun example, again from my time in Guatemala. I went to a wedding when I was there, and these are banana leaves that the women are preparing the food on. They serve the food on the banana leaves, they cook the food on the banana leaves, and sometimes they can even eat them, but they're also used as a mulch too. So multiple functions. So you wouldn't just have something that only serves one function. Like in our Western culture, it's like single-use cups or bags are, fairly ridiculous that we use it. I think of that myself when I go, I don't know, get hot chocolate at Starbucks, and I drink it, and 5 minutes later, that cup is in the garbage. It had like the shortest use life for how long it took to create it, and then how long it's going to sit in the landfill. So the more functions you can have for each thing in your design, the more sustainable it's going to be, the cheaper it's going to be in the long run to sustain, the more pleasurable it will be to maintain that landscape, because you won't have to work quite so hard. Natural systems don't work that hard to maintain themselves. They're just slowly hanging out, and the things that don't work too well in a natural system either migrate or move away or die. So we want to build our systems, our garden systems, our farm systems, into a similar type of model where they're fairly self-sustaining on their own. And if things don't work, we change them. Permaculture, again, is not trying to get the corner on knowing exactly how everything should be. One great thing about permaculture is it is very adaptive. It's like, and I know the permaculture farm that I take classes to often is in Cuyama. That's from Ojai north up and over the hills into the high desert. And they practice permaculture design very well, meaning they're constantly looking at the design and seeing what's not working and tweaking it and changing it and adapting. It's not about making a design and leaving it that way. Most landscape design that we see now are farm design. The farmers and the landscapers put something there, and then they do as much as they can to keep it exactly like that. They prune things back, they add water, they add fertilizer, they do not let things die off that can't handle it on their own. There too many resources go into upkeeping designs that are not sustainable on their own. Even more refined are permaculture, what some call attitudes. So you've got the ethics, the principles within that, and the attitudes within those. And they're, again, kind of like the ethics, how you'd ask yourself a question to see if your design is following one of the permaculture ethics. The attitudes help you understand how to design something. So I like these a lot. They're kind of fun. The problem is the solution. That's a great one. And I think for my whole life, or anyone's life, it's like, if I have a problem, realize the problem that you're seeing and you're facing is a representation. It's a symbol that something's not working right. And that symbol can guide you to doing something to improve that. I think of human health a lot, like when you get a cough or a sore throat. Okay, there's a problem. There's a sign that something's off. Maybe you haven't gotten enough sleep. Maybe you aren't getting enough vitamins. Maybe you've got, maybe you're actually getting sick, and that could be from stress or overworking or many things. So in designing a system, the same thing can happen. If you've got your worm bin and it's suddenly getting all moldy and mushy, that's not working right. And then you start thinking, okay, what do I actually see is possibly the cause of this? You want to troubleshoot it. And it also takes off kind of the responsibility that you're supposed to know everything and do it right the first time. We're always learning and adapting. We have to be open to feedback from our design, from the natural world, from our agricultural systems, and adjusting so they become more sustainable and not neglect the problems and the feedback that we get. Another one, the yield is only limited by the designer's imagination. Another great one. Just means human capacity for creativity is virtually unlimited. We can continue to think of better and better systems and increase the yields of our systems, meaning maybe increase the amount of food that's produced at a farm, but it also could be the amount of social capital, meaning people are all happier and healthier because of the way you've designed this small community and this farm. And there's even more connectivity between humans, and there's more health, and there's more excess time and energy for each individual human to give away to someone else. I mean, no one is, I shouldn't say no one, but most people, when they get really stressed and they have so much on their plate, they hunker down. They're not in the mode of giving. They don't have a lot. Their cup is not runneth over. So you want to design a system that's efficient and supports humans too, and will create an abundance. And we have that ability in our minds to do that. We just need to keep thinking and keep being adaptive. All of these are great. Relinquishing power, least change for the greatest effect, integrate rather than segregate, and respond creatively to change. I could talk about each of them for quite a while, but let me give you a couple of examples. That will be more fun. Can't see these too well, but these are actually leafcutter ants. Leafcutter ants are pretty ubiquitous in the tropical world, but you can see they're little ants carrying they chew and they cut out these little sections of leaves and they carry them down into their underground ant colony, where they grow fungus on these pieces of vegetation. This is a banana leaf. And they eat the fruiting bodies of the fungus. So these ants are farmers, but they can also devastate your crop or a farmer's crop. When I lived in Guatemala, these leafcutter ants, one day I went down to our small demonstration farm. It was about an acre in size, it wasn't very big, but the leafcutter ants overnight had defoliated all of our papayas. I think we had about eight papaya plants that were about 6 feet tall. All the leaves were gone. And these were just hundreds of thousands of leafcutter ants had come out of their nest and marched in this thick black line from their nest to the papayas in our garden and taken all the leaves and the leaf foliage off. So I was not happy. And it took me about 10 months of trying to understand the problem. And I thought about this, that the problem is the solution. And at first, I was not like, no, it's not. It's just a problem. We need to get rid of these ants. The guy I worked with said, oh, let's pour gasoline down into the hole of the ant colony. And I'm like, no, we're trying to do organic gardening here. I don't think we need gasoline in our soil. So we kept trying all kinds of methods. Nothing could really keep these leafcutter ants away. We put diatomaceous earth around each papaya plant and other plants too. And that's just basically ground up chalk. But microscopically, it's very sharp, like it's like shards of glass. So the ants their feet get cut when they walk across diatomaceous earth. So putting it around your plant, sprinkling it in a circle around your plant is supposed to keep them away. Well, the leafcutter ants work as a huge network. They're just one big, kind of hive mentality. What they did is they would send some leaf some ants out onto the diatomaceous earth that would walk part ways, and I watched this happen. They'd walk part ways across the diatomaceous earth, this white powdery stuff, and they would start to hobble because they start to get cut, and then they couldn't walk anymore. And then more would be sent out, and those would kind of just lay there and die. And when there were enough that had done that, the ants, more ants came and walked across the backs of the ones that were now hobbled and dying. And that's how they accessed our plants. They built like a bridge of dead ants across the diatomaceous earth. And the rest of the ants just skimmed right over them now and got onto the plants and ate the plants up. So again, still I'm kind of going on, but it was a problem. And what we finally kind of figured out is we had to work with the system, and that was finding out where the ant colony was. Where was this leafcutter ant colony? And we found some local people, some older Mayan, Kekchi Mayans that said, oh yes, if you take this one type of banana, it's this red banana that you can find in the forest over here. They said, get one of those, plant it in the leafcutter ant colony nest, and it will make the leafcutter ants go away. And so after about a month, we finally found a couple of these plants growing wild in the forest, planted them in the leafcutter ant nest, and those leafcutters ants they moved away within a couple of days. We had no more leafcutter ants because they did not like that one plant. That plant must have done something to the soil to deter the leafcutter ants. So that was my example of problem is a solution. Long-winded example, but very interesting how you need to be patient to try to find solutions sometimes rather than going right for pesticides. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're trying to design a permaculture garden or farm, but you are looking just at conservation. So water conservation. How are you going to improve the conservation of water at your site? Be more efficient with water. That's a big topic for Southern California. One of the ways as a permaculture designer, I'm going to try to capture and store as much water that comes to the site. Maybe it comes as a creek. Maybe it comes as precipitation, rain, fog. You want to design your site so it captures the water there and holds on to it, stores it in the soil or in a tank off the roof. You want to keep it there because water is really important. You don't want it just to run off down into the ocean. You want to try to capture it and store it. You want to use water as many times as possible in that system so it isn't, it's just, again, more efficient, conservative way to deal with water. And conserve water as much as you can, and water leaving the system should be clean. Like let's say you have water that when it rains, it comes onto your site and then runs off onto the neighbor's property. It should not be causing erosion or having, maybe if you used some kind of chemicals or pesticides, even if they're natural chemicals, they could get into the water system and then run off into the neighbor's site. Or around here in Santa Barbara, we have basically have mountains that all the water that hits the mountains on the south ridge of the front country here, all that water eventually goes into the ocean pretty quickly within like a couple of hours at the most. So if you you just used Roundup or something that's not so good for other organisms, it's going to end up in the ocean, and that will affect marine plants. So your water leaving the system should be clean. So the last slide was telling you, your goals with water, how you're going to manage water in general, but specifics now. What are the methods then you would use to actually conserve water as a permaculture designer? You could dig swales on sloped land to slow the water down, spread it out and sink it in. We'll talk more about swales, but they are like kind of like a ditch and berm that are dug on contour, meaning they're level. You have a ditch that's on a slope, but the ditch is not to take water and run it off somewhere. It's to just hold the water. It's like a pond, a long, thin pond along the slope of some kind of hillside to catch water so the water doesn't run off, but it stops. It's held in that long, thin little pond, and it soaks into your soil and hydrates the soil, helps the microbes, helps the plants. You're capturing that water with this swale. You might decide in the dwelling you're going to put a front-loading washing machine, something that uses very little water. You might install a rainwater catchment system off the roof, and you might capture and use gray water from the house. Those are all great methods for conserving water. Gray water systems, if you don't know much about them, gray water is water that comes out of clean sources from your house. So it comes out of sinks, showers, laundry, bathtub, not so much the kitchen sink, and not toilets. So toilet water is called black water in the water conserving world. So that upper left image is showing you the laundry to landscapes kind of idea, where you can take the water that comes out of your washer, put it through a filter, and have it go right out to your landscape to water the plants. Most people don't have that. Their laundry water goes right into the sewage system. It takes energy, time, infrastructure to keep that going. The water's only used once. It's not a very efficient way to use water. Look at the toilet system. So you've got a sink and you brush your teeth or wash your hands. It's really not that dirty. I mean, you wouldn't want to drink it, but it could still go out to the plants. In this case, that stuff that goes down the drain of the sink goes to fill the toilet tank. So when you go to the bathroom, you're not going into purified water. You're going into partly used water, but it doesn't matter. It's going to the sewage system anyways. You probably know this, but water is delivered to our homes in most places in the United States by municipal resources like the city, and that water is purified to the drinking level, so you can drink it, but then we fill our toilet tanks with purified drinking water and go to the bathroom in it. That makes no sense to spend all that time in purifying water and then to put it in the toilet. So gray water systems are a great idea for that. And something we'll talk about more is that a lot of systems that are more ecological, like this sink toilet system, are more economical too. You're saving water, you're saving time, you don't spend as much money because you do pay for your water. And though things that are more ecological and economical are often illegal. So this is not a legal system. It's not permittable. You have someone building your house, they can't hook up the sink to your toilet like that. Building codes have said, no, that's a no-no. Composting toilet? No, you cannot. Those are illegal too. Or, it's better to say you cannot get a permit to do that. But it's an interesting idea. So a lot of these new, alternative, more efficient ecological systems are on the edge of our technologies, meaning they haven't been adopted and become normalized yet, so they tend to be not permitted. I like this picture of this guy taking a shower. I mean, this is super simple, taking a shower outside. So he's watering his plants as he's taking a shower. Instead, that's two uses of the water. Instead of when you go into your shower, inside the house, the water goes down the drain into the sewage system. It goes right back to be purified again when it could be used for watering your plants. You're paying for both of those things. And the center picture is a small, compact water purification system. The water comes out at gray water from, sometimes it can be black water too, from your toilet, and goes into these progressive little parts of this system. It goes into the first little cubicle and is treated by microbes and rocks. It's any kind of refuse or fecal matter or urine or stuff that comes from your sink too, would be broken down by the microbes, and it goes, when that's done, it stays there for a little while, and then it moves to the next one by overflow, where plants will further purify the water and break it down, and it moves through this whole system. By the time it comes out, it's clean again. So these systems we have the technology, they're just not common, they're not popular, and they're not legal yet. But you can have a small system like this on your site, and you could just keep reusing the same water over and over and over. And you might have to get some new water, but it would be much more efficient. Here's a picture back to the garden I worked in and developed in Guatemala, but talking about swales, soil and water conservation. So swales are a great thing to conserve water and soil. If you look to the left side of the picture, it goes uphill. To the right side, it's going down. So it's going down from left to right. And the swale is that ditch you can see, this kind of curved ditch, and then the berm, the soil that was dug out to make the ditch, is put on the downhill side. So when water flows from the left to the right, like it did many times in rainstorms, it would come down the hill, and it would carry sometimes sediments and some of our organic matter that we don't want to wash away. It would go into the ditch and just sit there. That ditch is curved because it's on contour, it's level. It's not flowing down, it's just completely level, like a long, thin pond. It's meant to hold the water there, not have it flow any direction. But by that, the water and the sediments that are in the water when it flows from left to right down this hill in a storm sit in that little ditch, and the sediments settle out. So we've recaptured the nutrients that are in the sediments and keeping them for our garden. We'll plant things that like water, like a lot of water, in the bottom of that ditch. And then the berm on the downhill side to the right, we plant other things that kind of like to be raised up. You can see some sticks sticking out of it. Those are actually yucca plants. It's a root crop that we planted in the berm of the swale. So to make use of that, so multiple uses for that one function. And the water sits in that and then slowly infiltrates into the soil. So we are taking that water, not letting it flow away, and keeping it in the soil for the plant's use in the future. This is an example of another swale, but on the top of the swale, I just did this a couple of weeks before I took this picture. I planted this plant called chaya. So it's a plant that grows really thick and fast, and it was a fence to keep out wild animals from getting into our garden. So it was a living fence. It was a fence. It was also a plant that you can eat. You just cook it, and it's like spinach, the leaves, that is. The swale conserved water. This whole thing produced food, kept out wild animals, so it had multiple functions. Permaculture is all about that, because that's the way the natural world works. Each thing has many functions in a natural ecosystem. Conservation of resources, always helpful, especially in permaculture. This is called a keyhole garden. There was no, like I said, compost to be purchased around there. We had to build our own soil. We did that by building up layers of different kinds of organic matter we found around the valley where the garden was in Guatemala. So water plants, banana leaves, leaves from the jungle, other things, we layered them and they decomposed and slowly built up the soil in between those rocks. So it's lots of good conservation and use of local materials. So the basic question to begin a design for a landscape, most landscape designers, farmers think, what do we want to put here? What do the humans want to put here? And they leave it at that, whatever they want. Maybe it's a tropical, like I said earlier in this lecture, they want a tropical feel to their yard, or they want to grow almonds or coffee, in a place just wherever they feel like it. Maybe a farmer wants to try that. We know we've had in the past here in Santa Barbara, there was a person that grew bananas at the banana plantation down in La Conchita. So often humans just think, what do we want to do? Let's try to make it happen no matter what. So between this and the last slide, I'm just trying to make a distinction. The basic question for starting a landscape design using permaculture perspective, or an agricultural design as well, from the permacultural perspective is, the first question is, what is already going on here that we can work with? So what is already happening here that we can work with? How can we mimic the system? You need to observe and interact with that system first, of course, and use the knowledge of that to design a permaculture system that meets the human needs and supports ecological functions. And how? Well, we've been talking about how, and you'll learn more and more and more of the details on how to as we go along. So permaculture design can be a very overwhelming kind of thing to start to do, because permaculture integrates so many disciplines. You've got economics, you've got ecology, you've got sociology, you've got psychology, you've got agriculture. There's just a lot to try to integrate, and no one design will ever meet all the needs. That's not the way things work. But here are the tools that are used to help guide and get us towards a better design. Observing and interacting with the landscape, we talked about that already. But then these three tools, a sector analysis, zone analysis, and element analysis, are tools that we have for designing permacultural systems. So the first thing that is in our permaculture design toolkit is to observe and interact. Identify the existing resources that are there. Check out the topography, the climate, the soils, the water, and the infrastructure. You want to know what's already there that you can work with. One of the tools we'll use in permaculture design is called sector analysis. You look at all of the elemental energy flows moving through a site. Things like water, where does the water come from and where does it tend to move to? Source to sink. Where do the winds come from in the summer, in the winter, in the spring, and the fall? And where do they move to through that site? Where does wildlife move from and to in that site? The angle of the sun, how does that change in different seasons? How will that affect the plants and animals that live there? Also, the views is an important part of sector analysis. Is there areas that you want to block the view for more privacy or protect the view for more openness? Is there different types of potentially fire dangers from different directions? So the sector analysis looks at, just like what you're looking at here, an overhead directional design, and then looking at the north, south, east, west, and charting those or putting them onto that base map and looking at the flows of all these energy and elements and how they move on that site. Again, this sets you up to design the system so it works better with what's happening there. How many people have designed things not taking into account the way the sunlight hits different in the summer and the winter, or the way the winds move, or the way the water moves too. So if you set it up to go with that system, what you design there will be enhanced and supported by those natural energy and element movements, as opposed to being opposed to them. So sector analysis is a great tool, and you will be doing that in class. Sector analysis is taking your site and taking a top-down view of it, and then mapping out north, south, east, west of your site, and mapping all the different energy flows through that site. Different energy flows like where does the water come from, and when the water hits your site, where does it flow to? Where does the winds come from? Which direction are they moving across your site in the different seasons? How is the solar energy hitting your site in the summer and in the winter? Where's the shade? Where are the cooler, shadier areas in the summer? Where are the cooler, shady areas in the winter, and the hotter, drier, etc.? In our landscape around here in Southern California, where do the fires come from? We need to know how that moves across the land too. How does that, if things erode, how are the sediments moving? How is wildlife moving through the site and utilizing the area? Those are all different energy flows that we map out on a map, a north, south, east, west plat of our site. And it gives us an idea of how to work with it. So again, these are all just methods of learning how to work with what's happening there and utilize the energies that are at the site already. There's also zone analysis. And zones, it's different than the sector. It's just looking at how many times you visit an element. So you create these zones mostly around the dwelling. Imagine a house in the middle of a farm. The first zone, or like zone 1, would be the area closest to the house. Zone 2 a little further out, zone 3 a little further out. But you decide all the different elements you have. Let's say you have a kitchen garden that you put in, things used at the kitchen, like a veggie garden and herbs and greens. You want a chicken coop, a fruit tree orchard, and maybe some nut trees, and even some wild areas on the site. You would think about how often you have to visit each of those elements, and then put the ones that you visit the most closest to the house. So the chicken coop would probably need to be in zone 1 or 2, meaning relatively close to the house, because you're gonna have to visit it every single day. You don't want it to be really far away. The kitchen garden, also really close, because you use it. You go out there and cut greens and cut herbs, at least weekly. Fruit trees, you only go out there a few times a year, maybe pruning once a year, fertilizing a couple times a year, irrigation. We assume that's set up somewhat automatically, but you wouldn't be even irrigating them that as many times. So the visits to a fruit tree orchard would be a lot less than to like a chicken coop, and to a wildland even less than that. And you just make sure you're placing your elements in your design in ways that reflect how much time they're going to take for you to take care of them, your use. Another tool that we use is the zone of use analysis. And what you're looking at here is students' work. So I'll give you a number of little items. So the typical types of elements that you might have in a small farm. That orange square is a house, and then you have different elements like fruit trees, nut trees, hedges, ponds, and then these arrows that you're showing are on the whiteboard. Those are showing you the flow of water, the flow of wind, etc. But with a zone analysis, you're looking at basically how many times a day or a week or a year humans need to tend to that specific element. For example, a chicken coop. You have to go tend to chickens at least once or twice a day. So it's potentially 300 to 700 times a year you have to visit that coop. So you don't want to place it really far away from your dwelling, or that's wasted labor and time to walk all the way out there and all the way back. So the zones of use allows you to move these little elements around kind of just in this mock-up design system that you're looking at on the whiteboard, and move things around. So they're moved, the things that you have to visit a lot and take care of a lot are closer to your dwelling. The things that you don't have to take care of as much, like nut trees, which produce a crop of nuts once a year, and they take very little care once they're mature, those can be further out. And veggie gardens, things that you use in the kitchen, pretty much daily, if not weekly, greens and herbs, that should be really close to the dwelling. So those are the zones of use. How often you're going to use them determines where they're placed in the whole system. So again, the zones of use analysis, you're looking at the placement of the elements according to how much we use them and how often we need to visit or service them. From the center of activity, which is usually the dwelling. If you look on the right on the whiteboard, this is a finished zone analysis exercise we did in a past class, where the dwelling is the orange rectangle in the center, and that's considered zone 0. And then that first circular shape around that is zone 1. And in zone 1, you would have things that you need to tend to pretty often, like the chicken coop is right there on the edge of zone 1 to zone 2. Also, like a veggie garden or an herb garden would be right there in zone 1, or small dwarf fruit trees, things like that. Zone 2 is the next circle, 3 out there further, 4 and 5, and 5 is usually the wild native habitat. On this zones of use, you do place, you can see the arrows here and there. The blue arrow pointing downward, kind of in the upper center, that's showing you the general flow of water across the site. The yellow on the upper left shows you the general flow of the wind on the site. So that also gives you a feel. It's kind of mixing the sector analysis info in with this zone analysis. All three that I've mentioned, the observing, the zone analysis, sector analysis, again, they're helping us make the most efficient, productive, sustainable system we can. On the smallest scale of analysis is the element analysis. Each element in your design can be broken down and understood even in more depth. So it could be a chicken, a single organism that you have on the site, or it could be a bean plant or a certain type of tree or your pond. But you look at that, and we will be doing this interactively, so it's a little bit small to see here, but you list all the inputs, all the things that go into, let's say it's a chicken. What has to go into helping support that chicken? And then you also list all of the outputs. What are all the things the chicken produces? So all the things that go into the chicken or chicken coop, and what are all the things that come out of it, like eggs and meat and feathers and fun. And you also then think about the what intrinsically, genetically, that chicken needs to survive. And this helps us hone it even more to make sure that the chicken is relatively Well, you can see the title here, Designing for Relative Location. This element analysis helps us figure out which elements should be near each other. If chickens, one of the big inputs for chickens is food and a cool climate, they don't want to be out in the blazing sun or hot wind, then you'd know that that chicken coop needs to be in a place that's protected and fairly cool, but also near a food source. Maybe if you let them out into their run, they're near an open grassy area for pastured, chicken eggs. So it helps you decide which elements, how close they need to be each other, which ones are going to really depend on each other for placement and not having those too far apart, which would create more labor for you. Let me just finish up this lecture with a little kind of an op-ed. This is my opinion that permaculture has been, I'd say, known mostly as something that's kind of alternative and maybe a little bit hippy-dippy. And when you have a permaculture garden, it's going to be like using old tires and used wood and brick, and it'll be really cool and funky and maybe sustainable, but not all that attractive. Depends on the person, but if you look at the greater designs, landscaping around the country and the world, usually the most popular things are a little bit more manicured and polished than what you're seeing come out in permaculture. So the upper left picture is a permaculture garden, high function, lots of production of food, building of soil, conserving of water, lots of function, but it's lower in form. It's not quite as polished and pretty. I like it. You might like that garden a lot, but how many people, if you were a landscape designer and you showed them this picture, do you think you could sell them this? Telling them, I can do this for you. Isn't it beautiful? And most people are kind of more conventional, and they'd say, that's kind of cool. It's a little bit, looks like, a junkyard. So, and then you look at the bottom right picture, these gardens that tend to be thought of as the most beautiful. They're very high form, beautiful in form, but almost zero ecological function. I mean, there's no flowers there for pollination. It's only like 3 species. It's very non-diverse. It takes a lot of water, a lot of nutrients, a lot of fertilizer. It's just very non-sustainable, except with a lot of human inputs. That's the reason you see it like that. So for permaculture design, I think that we need to find a happy middle where we are producing something or designing something that's attractive to the human sentiment, and we also want it to be functional and healthy and productive too. For example, this picture on the left is a good example, not perfect, but it's more of a mixture of those two. It's got some symmetry, it looks pretty, and it's also got some permacultural aspects built into it. So it's using a lot of native plants, drought-tolerant plants. The pavement there has diamondia in the joints around that fountain, so water infiltrates rather than having a big concrete thing where the water runs off. So we've got some water conservation and soil conservation there, and a lot of Mediterranean plants that are adapted to the climate that won't take much extra water. So there's some sustainable aspects built into that kind of gives a good example of what permaculture is aiming towards. That right image is called the food forest or the forest garden. It's where in permaculture we take a place where we want to build and grow an orchard, but we want to have it be multi-level in its vertical shape. So we want to have big trees that produce something, new fruits, nuts, medium-sized trees, maybe dwarf fruit trees, shrubs, things that are ground covers, vines. We want to maximize the vertical space that's used for production.